Done hearing from me. I want to introduce our moderator for the night. Sorry, I don't want to mess up her name. Ilana Brownstein, and she's the director of new work at Company One Theater. Ilana?
Right here.
Oh, there. Sorry.
Hi, welcome. Indeed, that is my title. I use she, her pronouns. And I wanted to just mention that Company One Theater is a Boston-based multiracial theater company whose mission is to create community at the intersection of art and social change. And before I invite our candidates up here, I'm so sorry to the stage manager. You're really going to hate me. Could we have the lights up a little bit, if it's possible? They may be pre-programmed. Ah, very good. Hi. Oh, hi. Hello, it's really nice to see you. I hope you'll take a moment and look around this room and see who's here with us. Before we begin, I just would like to take a moment to breathe together. Sometimes we come into spaces like this and we are still bringing with us all the stressors of the day. I imagine that is 100 times true for our candidates who are traveling the state and showing up at many events. So I'm just going to ask us to spend a moment, just take a couple deep breaths together, because we're just humans in a room. Thanks. I think it helps us to feel a little more connected so that we can have a really great conversation with one another. So I'm going to invite our candidates to come join me up here, and I'll give the shortest of introductions to them, and then they'll be able to speak about their own things for a few minutes, and I'll tell you more about the format as we get going. So come on up, friends. So I'm going to introduce folks. I think I'll start directly to my side here. This is Dr. Tammy Gouveia, who we're so happy to have you here with us today. Tammy is a state rep for the 14th Middlesex District, which includes parts of Acton, Carlisle, Chelmsford, and Concord. Did I forget any? Perfect. And she is a social worker and policymaker with a special interest in public health. Next down the line, we have Eric Lesser, who is a state senator for the 1st Hampden and Hampshire District, which includes a whole lot of towns. I'm going to try and get them all right. Belchertown, Chicopee, East Longmeadow, Granby, Hampden, Longmeadow, Ludlow, Springfield, and Wilbraham. Right on. Eric is a lawyer who specializes in issues of economic development, and as a side hustle, which I know artists appreciate, we all appreciate a side hustle, he served as the script consultant for 7 seasons of Veep on HBO. And finally, down at the end of the line, we have Kim Drescal, a longtime mayor of Salem and the first woman to hold that office. She's an attorney by training and calls herself a proud member of the Get Stuff Done wing of government, which I feel like we can all appreciate. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm going to say a little bit about what the structure of this evening is going to look like, and then I will turn it over to each of you for some opening statements. So those opening statements will be about 3 minutes each. I have a watch, but I'm not gonna interrupt you unless we go well over. This is a moderated conversation on the future and possibilities of Massachusetts' art and culture sector, with answers of about 1 to 2 minutes each, with some leading questions I'll throw your way, and some follow-up questions that I hope we'll discover as our conversation gets going. And then at the end, we'll have closing statements of probably about 3 minutes each. So we'll hold that time at the end. This is not a debate. I think it's important to say that. Though it was great to hear the 3 of you last night on GBH. I did enjoy that debate. That was the race's first formal debate. But you can relax, because we're not here to fight about anything, nor did you last night, frankly. Well, very nice. This room is full of arts and culture workers and stakeholders, and we're really excited to hear about how, in your vision, the Lieutenant Governor can strengthen this important state sector. Before we really get going, I am mindful of who is represented on this stage and who is not. Our collected racial, gender, ethnic, and economic identities are not fully representative of the rich diversity of Massachusetts or of the arts sector. Many, in addition to those of us on stage, there are folks in the room, but many could not be here tonight due to lack of access, be it economic or transportation, health, or dependent care support, or they did not feel welcome for one reason or another, or did not feel that events like this are for them. This is certainly a challenge that is facing Massachusetts across many sectors, and I want to make sure that we bring an equity lens to our conversation tonight because that is really important, especially in the arts and culture sector. So I would like to turn it over. I think I'll ask you to start, Tammy, and just turn your mic on, and I'll give you about 3 minutes. Let us know what's going on with you.
You can all hear me? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you all for putting this together. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I appreciate the exercise that you started with us just before we got started with grounding us and bringing us into this space as a community. Something that I really appreciate as a social worker and as a mom and as an activist. Just a little bit about me. I grew up in the city of Lowell. Art is the handmade good is the motto for the city of Lowell. So I really grew up with that stuck in my brain. I also was lucky enough in growing up in a musical household. My dad was in a band, and I listened to live music because they practiced in my basement all while I was growing up. And I remember the first time I ever went to a bar and went dancing, I was 12 years old to hear him play. So music and art is definitely something that I have appreciated while growing up. As an adult, as a social worker, as a public health expert, I've also done work in spaces with, putting human-centered design in principles into action. And the reason why I got into this race is because of the ways that our state has been leaving people behind for decades. The lack of investments in our communities, in our families, making sure that our transportation systems work, that they're accessible, making sure that our housing is affordable and humane, making sure that every person has access to full education that includes STEAM, and I'm hoping we'll get into some questions about that later because I have some ideas. But I got into this race because we are leaving so many folks behind, and our pandemic response was truly, in my mind, as a public health expert, a privatized response that forced people to engage in Hunger Games style to try to get access to a vaccine. And that continued when it went on with trying to get access to rapid antigen tests. So that's what drew me into this race. I've been a single mom for 14 years, so I've also experienced the financial insecurity, the isolation, the shame, the worry that comes with not knowing how you're going to get by when your bank balance is negative yet again, and you have to borrow money just to put food on the table for yourself and your family. So that's why I'm in this race. And as the next lieutenant governor, what I'm really focused on is putting the health, the well-being, and the dignity of every single person at the center. So we're really focused on people and being people-centered as we're making decisions, as we address the climate crisis, the housing crisis, the mental health crisis, the childcare crisis, and as we're trying to make our way and ensure an equitable recovery from COVID. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I really look forward to our conversation, and I want to thank my colleagues for being up here with us. And again, nice to see you again today. So, yeah, I got it. Thanks.
Well, can everybody hear me? Okay, great. I can't really see anybody because of the lights, but I'll do my best to make eye contact. Just want to thank you, Alana. I want to thank my fellow candidates, Representative Gouveia and Mayor Driscoll. It's great to be here in Worcester. Really appreciate and really admire all the exciting things that have been happening in Worcester in recent years. It's really a great model for our cities around the state. Of just a city on the move with so much happening and so much going on. So I thought what I would do is just introduce myself a little bit, share a little bit about who I am, why I do this work in 3 minutes, but I do want to specifically tie it to arts and culture, programming and arts and culture in our Commonwealth. So I live in Longmeadow, which is a town right next to Springfield, about 60 miles or so west of here, but I'm not originally from there. I was born in Queens, New York. My dad grew up in the Sheepshead Bay housing projects of southern Brooklyn. A lot of the people he grew up with, they had tattoos on their arms from surviving the Holocaust. My mom, Joan Granucci, she grew up in a third-floor walk-up apartment in New York's Little Italy and shared a bed, not a bedroom, but a bed with her grandmother until she was in her mid-20s. Speaking of plays and performances, you know that play, My Dad is Jewish and My Mother's Italian and I'm in Therapy? That was a little bit of our upbringing. But I share that because we moved to Western Mass when I was 7, because that's where the jobs were and that's where the opportunity was. And central to our identity in the Pioneer Valley, and I see Russ Piotr here, who's been a leader in the sector for a long, long time, is the arts and culture. It's a central part of who we are. It's a central part of our economic strategy, of our cultural heritage, and of who we are as a community. And arts and culture has been central to my work in the Senate over the last 8 years in the state Senate. When I got started, I chaired our Committee on Arts and Culture, which oversees, of course, the Mass Cultural Council. I got to know Anita Walker very well, and of course Mike Bobbitt after Anita, and have worked very closely with many cultural organizations in the greater Springfield area over the last several years. Just a few examples, and I know we'll get into things in more detail. I've spent the last 6 years working with the Community Music School of Springfield on an adaptive music program that has gotten special education teachers at our Springfield Public Schools trained in music education and has gotten music teachers trained in special education. It's an incredible program that has allowed students that otherwise might not have access to music or access to, really feeling included in school to have another venue. I've also worked really closely with the Springfield Cultural Partnership, which has done intersectional work across various communities and groups in Springfield to try to use the arts, use culture to help empower communities and also lead to more growth and economic development. And another program I've been particularly proud of over the last several years is an effort to make sure that we have special education arts and culture teachers and music teachers in all of our public schools. It's shocking that in a state as wealthy as ours, as prosperous as ours, that has education as such a foundational principle as ours, that so many of our schools, high schools and middle schools, don't have music or arts education as part of their bedrock curriculum. We've worked to expand it to every school in Springfield. And I would be remiss if I didn't bring it up, but the Springfield Museums and the Dr. Seuss Museum has been a big part of the work we've done in Springfield. And every resident of Springfield can go to the Springfield Museums, which is a 5-museum complex, arts, history, science, for free. And that's something I'd like to see at all of our museums in Massachusetts, an important goal I think we should have for all of our local museums in all of our cities and towns. So thanks for having me.
Hey everyone, I'm Kim Drescal, I'm the Mayor of Salem, and I'm so thrilled to be here, not only to be in Worcester, which really just feels like the champagne cork is off this city, with so much happening, but frankly to be in this particular space. Wonderful performance, a chance to be with colleagues, and to really talk about something that's not only near and dear to my heart, but so key to what makes our community and so many communities across Massachusetts special. The arts, the artists, the cultural assets, the organizations, key to our identity in my community for sure, key to our quality of life, our economy. It's embedded in so much of Salem. I thought I would share just a little bit about who I am, why I'm enthusiastic about this race, and some of the work we've done, and try and get it in under 3 minutes if I can. So I'm not a native of Salem, I'm actually a Navy brat. I was born in Hawaii, lived on both coasts. My dad grew up in Lynn, and my mom is from Trinidad. We moved around a lot, and I came to Salem to go to college. And frankly, I never left. I fell in love with the community. I fell in love with my husband, Nick, and together we raised our 3 children there. I was not always the mayor of Salem, although I have been mayor for the last 16 years. My first experience in local government was working for the city of Chelsea as they came out of receivership, a city that was really down on its knees. I was hired as part of a team to be their in-house legal counsel and then became their deputy city manager. And that experience really taught me the value of good government and what it means to be on the ground helping people every day. And frankly, who pays the price when there are failures in leadership? And to no one's surprise, it's usually the most vulnerable among us. But while I was working in Chelsea, I was always living in Salem and feeling like this amazing community, took 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And some of the lessons that I learned in Chelsea, and frankly, the level of professionalism that I was experiencing working in municipal government, wasn't in place in my own hometown. So in 2005, I quit my job and decided to run for mayor in Salem. I wasn't from the community. Salem had never elected anybody who was not born and bred in Salem, and certainly not anybody who was not a male. So there's a bit of a hurdle there. But I worked hard and really felt a connection to improving city operations, to making sure that no matter where you live, you're going to have benefit coming from your local government. And if you think about what local government does, it's frankly the branch of government we all rely on the most: educating our kids, keeping our neighborhoods safe, investing in those places you make memories. Places like this, city squares, downtown parks. 16 years after being elected, Salem is really a hip, historic, vibrant destination. We've made historic investments in parks, in schools, in buildings. And I'm really proud of the work we've done, particularly around the creative economy. And that was a lesson for Salem. As much as we had this amazing history, we're an old city, and people were used to, you go to job with a lunch bucket, you have a shift, and you work. And we started to talk about the creative economy and what that meant, and those of you here know it's an industry, but it's very much, as Liv said, 3 or 4 jobs, it's a side hustle. And we really wanted to make sure we understood the value of that creative economy, of arts and culture in our community. So we created a public art master plan that mapped out those assets, brought people together. I was fortunate to hire the first full-time public art planner in our community. That's led to sustainable investments for, murals and sculptures and monuments. We revitalized a historic block known as Artist Row. That's where we have incubator space for artisans and arts, and that's where our Artist in Residence program is. It's really given us a chance to lean in. The amount of resources that we've been able to take away from that one incubator space and that Artist in Residence program is amazing. We've also worked to make sure we've got sustainable models to invest in art, in placemaking, in festivals, the sorts of things that bring people together and really talk about it as an industry. The thing about the arts sometimes is we don't think of it as important as life sciences or STEM or industries that Massachusetts is known for, yet this is fundamental to the fabric of the places we live and the quality of life that we all enjoy. I'm proud of the work that we're doing now to embed art in so much more of what we do, in public projects, from new pools and roadway projects and vertical construction as well, both private and public sector. That started with bringing people together to understand the value of art in our community. So thrilled to be here, thrilled to talk about this and engage in this conversation and find ways to make sure that what we're doing on the ground in communities and how that connects to the state is critical. As Lieutenant Governor, I really want to lean into this work. I think we should have a cabinet secretary focus on art and culture, that we really have a sustainable revenue stream. It feels like we're always begging for crumbs of resources, and I think there's an opportunity for us to do more there in that space.
Thank you very much. So you both sort of preempted one of my first questions, but I want to make sure that that you have a chance also to share. My question was going to be about, in your currently held office, how do you prioritize arts and culture? And I think we got a pretty great picture from our opening statements, but I want to make sure you have a chance as well.
Yeah, thank you. So, when COVID hit, we heard quite extensively, really loudly and clearly about the needs of the arts and culture sector when COVID hit and just the impact on livelihoods. As a doctor of public health, I was one of the early folks calling for, unfortunately, restrictions on in-person gatherings, which I know had tremendous impacts. But I also called for getting cash benefits out to folks immediately. It wasn't something that we were willing to take up in the legislature, but I think there's always an opportunity to do a both and, do what's in the best interest of public health and safety, while also making sure that we aren't leaving anybody, straggling or suffering or stressed out and worried about how you're going to get your basic needs met. I really carried that perspective through the whole COVID pandemic. It's actually really how I've always lived my life as a social worker, as an activist, as someone who grew up in a gateway city, just making sure that we are calling on government, that we are expecting our state and local governments to make sure that we are all invested in I firmly believe that the successes that I have are really wrapped up in people I've never even met, my neighbors from across the state, and the successes of their children. So it's not a specific mindset towards the arts and cultural space, but making sure that so many of the folks like you here in this room who are probably gig workers or you're working as consultants and supporting artists, that they're really front and center and also included. And I think that's the kind of thing that we need to continue to have an eye towards as we address housing, as we address the big issues that are already here. So I think I'll leave it at, well, I'll say one other thing, because that is my current job, is focused on advocating for policies that really speak to the needs of our residents. But throughout my career, prior to getting elected as a state representative, I did some work, as I mentioned, focused on human-centered design and rapid cycle prototyping, and some work with IDEO, and thinking about how do we engage artists at the table as problem solvers, as folks who help us get to the root causes of the problems, because you're already you show up on the planet thinking about people first, and that's part of the training. And so really bringing you in, I agree with Mayor Drescal, having some sort of cabinet level position where there are artists and residents to help us get at the root drivers of those issues, not just in beautifying and bringing community spaces together, but also in addressing the big issues of the day.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All three of you have touched on something that is really important for me personally, but I think across our sector. So, we can talk about the arts in a couple of different ways. We can talk about intrinsic impact. So what the arts do for us as humans as we try to understand our lives, each other, our communities, and the great existential questions, right? We can also talk about, as we have in this conversation already, we can talk about economic impact. How the arts drives economic benefits for associated businesses, for neighborhoods, for areas of cities, for transit, for things like that, as well as the impact of the workforce itself, right? And the folks who actually are arts workers, because arts work is work. So we can talk about it in those two ways, and I think that oftentimes, especially in, I think, state-level conversations, it's separated into conversations about intrinsic impact and conversations about economic impact. But I'm interested whether we could maybe have a conversation here about an amalgamation of those two positions. So where, because of the emotional value and the ways that participating in art making or witnessing the work of artists, how it impacts us personally, that it can be an integral component of building stronger cross-sector initiatives with regards to housing, public health, transit, education. You are asking the voters to support you in an executive level position, the lieutenant governorship, which actually has some flexibility in the fact that it has almost no definition in terms of the things you are required to do. There's just a few things. And so many lieutenant governors work with the governor they serve to define a set of initiatives or priorities. I would like to hear from you, each of you, how you might envision the arts sector as part of this amalgamation of where the arts meets other things, other sectors in our state that are really important for the health of our communities. Whoever would like to start.
I'll take a shot at going first, and I think there's probably lots to think about in that particular question, so hopefully we can have a lively discussion. When I think about what we do in government, there is this sort of return on investment component. We're not spending our money, we're spending taxpayer dollars, so we tend to always look at the economic benefits, but the intrinsic value here is so real, and I think understood by many individuals, but how do we think about that work and embedding it in what we do? And where I go to, especially, government is slow to change, right? As we all know, is embedding the work of artists and thinking about how we embed that work in all that we do. Like, imagine for a minute if the folks who worked at the MBTA, if we had artists embedded in how we thought about the wayfinding signage. I'm not talking about running the trains or preventing them from catching on fire, which has been a problem lately, but I'm talking about the everyday experience that people have. So much of it you rely on through some level of government. Imagine if we had a civic core of artists helping us, like New York City does, right? And how we think about communicating with residents. So much of what government struggles with is that level of engagement, whether it's a new program rolling out for how you're going to pick up trash, key things, or the way that you engage space and people entering space. It really turns the table. We have engineers doing that. You have bureaucrats doing that. How do you embed people with different skills around the table to think about this particular value? Well, the way you do that is through budgeting. So I hate to say get back to the economic value. It's really showcasing the difference that can happen when you have artists in these spaces. So I think we need to have a commitment to invest first, right? To recognize that this is going to be valuable to an organization. We recently redid a whole entire recreational and conservation area, including a new pool. As part of that concept, we had an art competition for the splash pad outside. Like, amazing work was created by artists, both some local and some from further away, that was embedded into a public works project that was a 100-year-old pool that will hopefully be there for at least another 50 years. Never would have thought of how they engaged the splash pad and the pool and the signage and how it all worked together unless we took that leap. So those of us in government need to be prepared to say, no, it's important to have an artist core embedded in the very basic functions of governing, and expect that you're not only going to get an economic value out of that, but you're going to get an intrinsic value out of that. And that would be my at least first recommendation as we think about this. And I could go on education, but I will leave that. And youth, so much of our youth coming out of this pandemic are really struggling right now, how we think about art therapy and embedding that in the schools. As mayor, I also chair the Salem School Committee. Salem is a gateway city, very diverse. We teach in over 49 languages. Like, there's a lot happening right now with young adults, and I think art is a really important component for us to ingrain in how we think about that, the interruptions and disruptions of our educational system as we move forward.
Thanks for the question, Alana. And there really is a lot of alignment and agreement among the three of us. But it's a really key question and something I struggle with, frankly, in terms of articulating the value of arts, because I think that there is a tendency to immediately go to the dollars and cents argument. But just to acknowledge that for a second, I do think that that is important to remind our broader political community about, because there is a misconception. In Massachusetts, you hear a lot about the eds and the meds, the life sciences, the tech sector, the schools, the hospitals as drivers of the economy. But the reality of it is that the arts and culture and tourism sectors are our third largest sector by employment. So it is a very important economic engine for the state, and we shouldn't be shy about saying that. And you all pay taxes just like every other industry and every other sector, and you're generating visits, you're generating parking in downtown, you're generating restaurant stops and everything else. So we do have to lean into that as much as we can and remind people of it. But just a couple of examples of just the intrinsic value and what makes arts and culture so unique as a intersectional solution to a lot of different issues. I've been involved, and we haven't gotten it done yet, but as Lieutenant Governor, we're going to work to sign legislation creating a Percent for Arts program. I know many of you have worked on this. This has been a priority of Mass Cultural Council for a long time. Think about if a percent of every public building, public construction project included a component of public-facing art. You know, we used to do that in this country. You think about the incredible WPA projects, the murals that you see in some of those buildings from that era. Think about what it can do to our public spaces. Think about how a courthouse could become so much more welcoming, so much more of a comfortable space for people if you invite artists in to help design it and to help design both the entrances and the interior. Just a couple of other examples. Art in mental health, and art and music and culture, and I say art broadly, art meaning all artistic work, as a way to help solve a very severe crisis we face right now around mental health. I know Mass Cultural Council was involved and Mass Creative was involved in an effort we had in the legislature to set up a prescription program for arts and culture. So the idea is that the way a doctor or a mental health professional might prescribe medicine will prescribe attendance at a cultural organization or participation in an arts community event and pay for the ticket because oftentimes these activities are not accessible to people. That was a pilot program that was done at the Mass Cultural Council. I'd like to see that expanded because I think it could be a great way to help people deal with the stress that we're facing in our society right now. Go to a performance, go to a museum, spend time engaging in that part of your brain and that part of your soul, and it will help a lot. You know, I could go on, but another important way we can integrate arts into more sectors in the way it's sort of inherently valuable in and of itself, let alone the dollars and cents, is in education. I feel very strongly about this because I've seen this in my communities. You can teach math through art, through music. You can teach English through spoken word, through hip hop, through all kinds of expression. Oftentimes we forget that the arts can be a bridge and an opening for so many other sectors, so many other disciplines that people might not otherwise get access to or feel comfortable engaging with. So we need to build that into curriculums more. And we need to just be comfortable with acknowledging that we can give grants, we can support art programs, theater programs that might not return a dollar for dollar investment, but it's important because it's just inherently important. The same way, you know, a road or a train or or an airport might not initially pay for itself. It's an investment in the future that you put in for future generations. So it's a really important question and a really important topic. And as Lieutenant Governor, I think a role you can play is helping lift that work that's already happening in a lot of different communities around the state and try to replicate it and scale it to more places and to more areas around the Commonwealth.
So the way I'm thinking about this and the way I heard the question was, when I hear the word intrinsic, what I automatically kind of go to is the individual. And that is all well and good. Art is left to individual interpretation. But I think one of the challenges that we've had is when we see things as something that belongs to the individual, we don't invest in it as a collective. We don't invest in it collectively. And therefore, we've underinvested in arts education. We've underinvested in our artist community. We've underinvested in performing arts centers. I was talking with someone just before we came in here, and I asked about, well, what are your revenue sources? Tickets and grants. You know, and part of those grants are, many of them are not state grants. They're not state dollars. And putting you all in a position where you're fighting for the same pieces of the small pie doesn't get us to the place where art is really, and culture is really a collective, and that's valued collectively. And the reason why this, for me, is pretty personal and important, and it goes to a little bit of what Senator Lesser said around education, is that I believe that the arts saved my child. Because we were growing up in the city of Lowell. When I became a single mom, I moved to Acton. And all of a sudden, they had access to greater arts program. Art was done every single day in their classroom for the entire time that they were in the class. That's not happening in every single community across the Commonwealth. Why? Because we see it as an individual choice based on this school district, or if you have enough money to make the investment in it. And oh, by the way, if you're in a school district under receivership, arts and music goes away. You don't even have access to that at all. And these are the students who probably need it the most, because it taps into who they are as people, bringing forth who they are as people, as makers, as problem solvers, as someone engaged. But when I think about my child, his name is Cam, he, they pronouns, I know that art saved their life. They are a photographer. They are crocheting. He crocheted like mad through the pandemic. And if they didn't have that as an outlet, I don't know what would have happened. And this goes to exactly the thing that I also think about where we've underinvested. Childcare, mental health, human services. Anything that is seen as optional or a nice to have or a luxury or something that is just inconvenient for us to invest in, we don't make the investments. And heck, we can even argue that the things that are vital, like our infrastructure, we haven't even been making those investments. So the way I think about supporting the collective well-being is to have a fairer tax structure, fair share amendment, change in the way that we do corporate taxes in our state, change in the way that we think about whose responsibility it is to pay for these things. Because I don't think that folks in this room and folks outside across the Commonwealth who are involved in arts and culture and music should be begging for grants from the state. It should be something that is automatically set aside as a must-have investment. And I also think about it as it relates to the climate crisis, because there's a lot of phenomenal design work that also goes into creating beautiful spaces where people want to gather, where people want to be in community, rather than sitting in their own house by themselves, isolated. So I see all of these issues as very interconnected. How we tax folks, how we think about investments, how we think about infrastructure, how we think about community design, and does it support accessibility? So I really appreciated the way you opened, acknowledging the fact that we are all white folks up here, pretty well educated, pretty middle upper class, have had a lot of privileges and great fortune in our lives, and who is left out of solving these problems? I don't know if there are folks with disabilities in this room, but we are not designing communities and housing to support our aging population, disabled people, and then we also have to think about long COVID and what that also means for possibly creating even more people with disabilities than we've ever even anticipated. So when you said the word intrinsic, I just heard individual and our rugged individualism, and you got to figure it out on your own. We are a Commonwealth. We need to start acting like it.
Thank you. I hope you'll allow me to take a moment. I would like to tell the three of you about two issues that are plaguing our sector. And then I would like to ask you, as I'm talking, to think about what, in your position as Lieutenant Governor, what would a specific strategic intervention look like? So this is one where I'm really looking for specifics. It doesn't have to be, and again, there's no right answers to these, right? But I want to give you these sort of two issues that are certainly top of mind for me these days. So the first one has to do with money for marginalized art makers and organizations. So because of the makeup and structure of the sector, there are small and mid-sized organizations across the state, in urban centers, in rural areas, in gateway cities, that serve audiences of color and audiences and participants of marginalized identities. But those organizations can't access the levels of public investment that the larger organizations, which are primarily white institutions, that they have access to. So this is a major equity issue, and I know it's not unique to the arts. I know just yesterday the three of you were talking about how this same problem manifests in government contracting. And yet, the arts is also, as you have all mentioned, wildly underfunded statewide at the executive level. The second issue I want to talk about, and these are really pulling threads that the three of you have touched on. In Massachusetts, biotech is absolutely a growth sector, right? It receives massive incentives, funding, and perhaps most importantly, workforce development initiatives and training that begins in the high schools. It cultivates workers for biotech, and it means that innovations that happen here are supported by people who live here. The arts sector does not receive this sort of executive level investment, especially in workforce development and training programs. And so young people leave the field or they leave the state due to the lack of opportunity, even though we have a wealth of higher education arts training programs. So when we lose the folks that train here because they can't find work here, or when folks who grow up here in our gateway communities, in our rural and urban centers, when they don't see the arts as a possibility, we lose entire generations of potential artists who, as we've already discussed, have the potential to create great change in our souls, in our hearts, in the ways we move through the world, right? So I would love to hear if you have any specific strategic interventions that could come from the Lieutenant Governor's office that might address one or more of these issues. There's a lot I just brought up, but I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
I'm happy to start. We actually have worked on a cultural arts platform as Lieutenant Governor that I would hope to work on if I'm fortunate to get enough to be elected. And because I believe so much in this industry, it doesn't act like an industry all the time, but it is an industry to your point, and how do we treat it that way? And I'll just say personally, one is showing up for performances, and two is paying for art. Two things we've insisted in my community. We don't ask people to give us their art, we pay for it. But here's a couple of ideas to pick up on what you said. One is working to establish a fund. Like, I can't say enough about resources, the necessity for it to be sustainable. And frankly, the time is now. We have historic resources in the state, both federal ARPA dollars, which are designed post-pandemic to help people that were impacted by the pandemic. I can't think of another community that has been impacted more, frankly, than artists, cultural institutions, and the like. So working to set up an investment fund, I picked the number of 25 million, higher, lower. With Commonwealth Arts Development Agency, we have development agencies for housing, we have development agencies for high tech. You talked about the other industries within life sciences. How do we work to set up a structure? Because we need a structure for this. We just can't all like it and love it and feel good about it. We need to put a structure in place within state government, which will allow us to raise money, to acquire and hold property, to finance the acquisition and development of cultural assets. Sometimes the most difficult part of funding at any level is those early startup dollars. When it comes to workforce training, why don't we have an Executive Office of Labor and Workforce and a program tied to the creative industries and to cultural workers? It's key. It's different than trying to career change into a STEM field. This is something that would be specific within regional workforce investment boards that we have throughout all of Massachusetts. A youth summer jobs program picking up on art and culture, so critical to get our young adults who have a passion for this, who have a desire for this, working in this field. With respect to thinking about BIPOC-led efforts, we can commit to multi-year funding and working with a cohort of BIPOC-led arts and culture organizations for support. Pick a number of organizations. Can we find 30 organizations that are doing great work? I could almost name 20 right now that are doing amazing work that we want to replicate in communities. Let's fund them. Let's not have them sing for their supper. Let's not have it be so difficult where they spend all the time raising money. That's time that could be going into programming. As we think about that, can we have a permanent function in the Mass Office of Business Development that's tailored towards supporting startup capital for creative businesses? Those industries, again, those startup dollars are really typical, really difficult to find. And lastly, a specific fund set up for disabled artists and arts organizations and programs that that feature disabled artists. Those are not off the top of my head. We really have given this some thought. I want to be clear, this is an area that I'm passionate about, that I've seen the value in my own community, that I really want to lean in. We don't have enough champions, frankly, in the State House for arts and culture that also understand the structure of governing. It's twofold, not just loving it, but also figuring out a way to make sure it's embedded so that no matter who is governor, this structure exists and can be funded.
Certainly ditto to all of that. And I appreciate the question, Alana, because I want to address the deeper structural issue behind that question. And we feel this acutely in Western Mass because, frankly, a lot of the most well-funded, highest endowed, largely white, largely male cultural organizations that have dominated the scene, so to speak, in Massachusetts are also almost entirely based in Boston. There's a few exceptions, but we're here in Worcester, which is in Central Mass, of course, does not have the same access to those types of institutions as there are in the city of Boston. And of course, obviously, communities within Boston don't have the same access to those institutions and those organizations. Just a little bit of context about the communities I represent. I represent some of the densest, most urban communities in Massachusetts. I also have a town without a stoplight. And I appreciate you also mentioning the lack of resources in rural communities, which is a severe problem in Massachusetts. We have urban communities, immigrant communities that are locked out of systemically locked out of access to arts support, arts education, arts funding. We also have rural communities that have been locked out as well. So just a couple of things on this. First, this is where public money does have to play a role, because public money has to be used for public purposes, which is helping catch up the organizations that have been left out and the communities that have been left out for generations. So we need to make sure that, for example, money spent by the Cultural Facilities Fund is spent in the highest need communities, which hasn't always been the case, by the way, with that program. And we've done audits and we've done oversight in the Economic Development Committee to look at that. Why would some of the wealthiest institutions be getting taxpayer-supported cultural facilities grants when you have small community theaters, you have local pop-up art installations, you have maker spaces in gateway cities that are getting nothing? That needs to be looked into, that needs to be investigated, and it really needs to stop. Mass Cultural Council grants and other cash grants that are granted shouldn't go to organizations that have massive endowments. They shouldn't go to organizations that have multi-million, in some cases multi-billion-dollar nest eggs to support their programming. It should go to the smaller, newer, more emergent community organizations with less resources. You know, and the other thing I would say is we need more visibility into some of these organizations, how they oversee their funds. You know, many of these institutions are massively powerful. We don't have to name names. We all know who we're talking about. They're massively powerful. They have massive endowments, and they benefit from incredible tax subsidy. I mean, their endowments are not taxed. And so I think we need to make sure and look at, well, hey, they get that tax subsidy because they're supposed to be providing a public good. How much are they opening up their spaces to underserved communities? How much are they reinvesting or redistributing some of the money that they're generating from those endowments and from those savings into the highest need communities? How much proactive outreach are they doing to bring in and to support emerging communities? And very importantly, watch where the money is. Are their boards diverse? Are their trusteeships diverse? And are they making an intentional effort and a proactive effort to change it? Because, you know, what's in the past is in the past. What we need to focus on is how we change and improve for the future. And we've got to make sure that they're presenting that. You also mentioned investment in workforce and workforce development programs. This is something I'm very passionate about. I chair our Committee on Economic Development, where we oversee our workforce training programs, our voc ed programs. I mentioned at the beginning the work I've done with the adaptive music program. That's a partnership between UMass Amherst, the Community Music School in Springfield, and the Springfield Public School System. Again, it takes music teachers who are being trained at UMass and helps train them and support them in their special education work. And it takes special education teachers who are being trained at our local schools and universities and helps them learn and be integrated into arts and music education. That's the kind of program we need to replicate everywhere. And we need to make sure that we're supporting career development in arts and culture, because it requires a lot of expertise, it requires a lot of training, and it often doesn't pay very well on the other end. So that's another area of really important growth for us as a state, something as Lieutenant Governor I'd really want to take on.
Yeah, I too thank you for the question. So I think when I think about workforce development, I think, well, where does it really begin? And it really begins in our schools and in our child care centers. And are there arts programs that are embedded within? Are they supported? And then are they supported all the way through the lifespan? So as I have already mentioned, I moved from the city of Lowell to the town of Acton. And when I made that shift, one of the things that I noticed that continues on for, you know, if people want to learn a new craft or learn a way to paint a certain way or cook certain foods, that they have access in the town of Acton to continuing education as adults. I don't see that in every single community across the Commonwealth. That's one way to tap into who might be somebody who has that talent and that drive and just hasn't had the time to lift their head up because they're just trying to get through their day. This morning I was in Springfield and I met with folks at the Performance Project, BIPOC-led, first generation focused program. And I asked the students, I asked the young people, what are the things that you wish that government leaders would do differently? And what they said was, invest in us. We don't need things that are for adults. The casino is not set up for us. We don't have places to go to be creative. We don't have places to go to hang out with our friends that are safe, that are places where we're not going to get in trouble. Those are the kinds of investment opportunities that I think of. And then when we kind of play that out, you know, we had a lot of conversations at the state level when we rolled out legalization of cannabis. And we created a trust fund to make sure that there was equity and access to those funds. Because as Senator Lesser has pointed out, the folks who are on these larger institutions that do get the funding because they have the capacity, they also have the capacity to keep raising a lot of money because they are in the boardrooms with other folks who are their friends, or, you know, those kinds of networks and connections that they have. So how do we create partnerships with BIPOC artists, with folks who are on the ground in smaller organizations, in a way that they are also able to tap into the resources that exist? So creating technical assistance funds and technical assistance support, but also making sure that we are serious about investing in artists who are here. So as you're pointing out, they're not leaving. We need to have the support, I think, for very diverse artists, because we bring forth different cultural expression. Right? I went to the Puerto Rican parade over the weekend, and I had so much fun listening to the music and the culture and the ways that everybody was celebrating Puerto Rican culture and history. Those are the kinds of things that we need to keep bringing forward and investing in those kinds of programs.
Thank you.
With real money.
Yes. So we are nearing the end of this portion of the program, and I just want to give a moment for each of you. If you have any closing thoughts, I invite you to share them. We can go down the line. And then I know we've got some exciting things that are happening right after this conversation, so I don't want to run over our time. But is there anything you would like to say as a closing thought?
Well, thank you again for having us and for the performance. This has been a really wonderful way to spend the evening. I am running to be a different type of lieutenant governor, really focused on putting people first, investing in our communities, investing in our young people, and really tackling some of the big issues by getting at root causes. There are 5 working groups that I want to create that I think I've already mentioned around climate and housing, mental health, childcare, and COVID. I want artists to be on those working groups to help us identify the root causes, but also to bring forth what are the issues that you're facing in the arts and cultural sector, and also what are the ways that we can identify the issues that we need to tackle towards the future. So that's why I'm in this race, to be a different type of lieutenant governor. And I thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
Well, thank you so much, Alana. Thank you to my fellow candidates. Thanks, everybody, for being here. And again, just want to say my name's Eric Lesser, running for lieutenant governor, as are, of course, everyone on the stage right now. And I just want you to know that I will be a champion and a partner to our arts and culture community, and an ally to our community. I've been there for the last 8 years in the state Senate, fighting to expand funding for the Mass Cultural Council, fighting to expand the Cultural Facilities Fund program, making sure that we're auditing the program to make sure that it's going to people and organizations and communities that need it the most. Just recently, when the ARPA funding came in, the governor's proposal initially had that money going through MOT, Mass Office of Travel and Tourism. A lot of you were involved in the advocacy for that. We helped lead the effort to rewrite that so it went through the Mass Cultural Council, because the MCC knows the communities the best, knows the players the best, knows the organizations the best. As Lieutenant Governor, I want to put arts and culture at the center of everything we do, at the center of our response to the mental health crisis, at the center of the response to our housing. We actually didn't get to talk about housing, which is an acute issue for artists and people in the arts community who are getting priced out of increasingly gentrifying neighborhoods and communities as rents and housing prices skyrocket. I want the arts community to be part of our transportation solution as we work to expand rail service. We're here in Worcester, which has helped been transformed by its rail connectivity to Boston. We now need to pull that rail service west to Springfield and Pittsfield, and of course continue with South Coast Rail. And I want to value and lift up the community because of what it is intrinsically, which was a topic that we all talked about today. We went through a lot. Everyone went through a lot through COVID, but no community was hurt or impacted quite like the arts and culture community was from COVID. The very nature of your sector is about community and collaboration and bringing people together. And COVID, of course, had to keep everyone apart. Not only was your community and the arts community the hardest hit by COVID, but I also think that your community, our community, the arts and culture community, is going to be the key to healing after COVID, because it's arts, it's culture, it's performance that helps bring people together, helps heal, helps rebuild and restitch community after a trauma that was experienced over the last almost 3 years. So I just really want to thank everybody for the invitation, for having us here today, and I'm really excited to get to work and to continue our partnership and our work together. Thank you.
All right, I'm batting cleanup, right? So I just want to say thank you so much, one, for having all of us here, giving us a chance to introduce ourselves to you, a little bit more about why we're excited about this race, and in particular for carving out time to talk about a topic that I think doesn't get talked about enough as often. I'm really grateful that you're organizing around getting to the ballot box to really support candidates that will invest in spaces and places that are not only going to help art and culture, but frankly help the Commonwealth. I think we're heading into some choppy waters as I think about what's ahead economically. I'm an optimist always, but I feel like with interest rates and inflation, a lot of uncertainty as we move forward, and also historic opportunities. You know, as mayor, the buck stops with me. I due respect to my colleagues. We've had an opportunity here to spend the time talking about art and culture and why those investments haven't been made already. We just passed sports betting. We've had cannabis. We've had all these new revenues coming into our Commonwealth. And every year it feels like the art and culture community has to fight for crumbs. And we rally to say, oh, it's going to get cut. And then it gets put back in. I'd love to be in a place, in a position where we're not doing that, where we're actually treating art and culture in a respectful industry, the way we think about life sciences or advanced manufacturing, or other meaningful places that have jobs, that add quality of life, that are important to our communities. That's what I've done as mayor. I think this race is about who's going to be a really strong partner for our next governor. You can tell we're all certainly supportive of art and culture, but who's actually going to embed the structure, the funding, in state government in a way that's going to allow us to make good on these promises and these ideas. I think I've done that at the local level. I firmly believe that what happens in our communities, the success of our Commonwealth, is based on working cities, cities that are thriving. And how are our communities thriving? Frankly, through a lot of art and culture. So I want to thank you for having me here, for giving me a chance to share a little bit more about my campaign. I'd be thrilled to have your support in this race. I'm excited to roll up my sleeves and get to work and take this experience from the Get Stuff Done branch of government to the State House and partner with our next governor and make sure we're putting art and culture in the center of all that we do moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much to our three candidates. Much appreciated.